Hello, 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 and welcome to week 2 of the CMA Studio Summer Session. My name is Joyce Beyer. I'm happy to be here with Civic Music Association to give you the inside scoop on some of the music being played by the Belin Quartet this week. We have a really fun lesson. Just a friendly reminder, if this is your first time with us, if you have any questions throughout the whole video, feel free to send them in the comments section. I'll do my best to answer them at the end of the video. And make sure that you stick around because we actually have another activity for you to do this time while you're watching the concert. So I'll give you a little bit more information about that. But if you're ready, I'm ready. Let's get going to the lesson.
Okay, week 2, and it's time to talk about today's goals. So by the end of today, I want you to be able to say, I can describe how a piano creates sound, and I can compare and contrast composers Joplin and Dvořák. Now, some of you may already know some of these things. Some of you, all of this might be brand new. Wherever you are on that, that's okay. The goal is by the end of today, you know some new information and you feel even more confident when you go to listen to the music that it's going to make more sense. So to start off, goal number 1, talking about the piano. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking to yourselves, wait a minute, we're supposed to be here for the Belin Quartet concerts. Why are we talking about a piano? Well, I think piano is a really important instrument to talk about when we're talking about music in general. A lot of the composers that you're going to hear about actually played the piano a lot. And a lot of the music you're going to hear, or at least some of it, was actually written for piano first, and then someone arranged it so that a string quartet could play it. I think part of the reason why this piano is so important to so many composers is it allowed them to be able to play lots of different voices at the same time. Whereas on a string instrument, you really don't always. You can play 1, maybe 2 very easily. The piano is kind of like an orchestra in the box. And so it allowed them to be able to hear a bunch of things at the same time as they were creating music. So let's talk a little bit about the family that the the piano is a part of, and that is the keyboard family. Now, most of you probably know there are actually strings inside of a piano, but it's not really considered part of the string family, and that's because of how it's played. But what it does have in common with a lot of other instruments is the fact that it has a keyboard, so a bunch of different keys that we play with our fingers. I have a photo here of a bunch of other different kinds of keyboard instruments that you may or may not have seen before. Last week, we talked about the pipe organ and the fact that it creates sound by having air, wind blown through those pipes. The accordion is kind of similar. We make it smaller and bigger, and because of that, air works and creates sound. On this, you'll also see there's something called the celeste. It looks like maybe celeste, but it's celeste. And when we hear a celeste, especially like in an orchestra, it sounds like little bells. And then there's also the harpsichord, which I think looks probably the most similar to a piano, but it's different from piano because instead of the piano having things hitting the strings, it actually plucks the strings like we do on a string instrument. It plucks them up. So it's a different kind of sound. And then, of course, there's the digital keyboard, which some of you may even have at home or have played on. All of these are kind of members of this keyboard family. But we're talking about the piano specifically. So let's talk a little bit more about how it works. So I said before, piano is sometimes considered maybe like a percussion instrument, and that is because of how it creates sound. I have a picture here that shows the hammers that are a part of piano. That's what's inside this. So we have these strings, but we also have little hammers that every time you play a note, a hammer comes up and hits that string. In order to create different variations, we have pedals. You probably can't see the pedals super well. They're down here. You play them with your feet. But the 2 main ones are a sustain pedal, a damper pedal, which when piano is played normally, we can hear every note pretty clearly. It stops the strings from ringing extra beyond what you play. When we play the sustain pedal, it lets every string keep ringing. And as long as my foot is on that pedal, it's going to keep ringing until it dies away, which is kind of cool. Composers use that to create different kinds of sound. There's another pedal, though, and this is the soft pedal, is what most people refer to it as. And what it actually does is it makes the piano softer. Different than normal. just makes it a little bit quieter, mutes it. And a composer would use these different pedals in order to, like I said, create different sound or to make things sound smoother and more connected. Because when you're just hitting different keys, sometimes it can be hard to make a line of music sound really smooth and connected. So those pedals exist so that we can make the sounds blend together a little bit more. So we talked about the piano. You've seen my piano here, maybe a little bit more about how it works inside. Time to stretch it out and talk about the composers for today, which are Scott Joplin and Antonin Dvořák. Now, just a review, in case you weren't here last week or you've forgotten, a composer is someone who writes or composes music. So we're talking about the composers, so you know a little bit more about them as people and also what you should expect when you hear their music. So first one that we're going to talk about today is someone I'm actually really excited about. He was one of my favorite composers growing up when I played the piano, and his name is Scott Joplin. He's part of why we talked about the piano today. Scott Joplin was a Black American composer. He was born in 1867 or 1868. I've actually seen it multiple ways reported, and he died in 1917. So he was born shortly after the Civil War ended. He was born shortly after slavery ended. His father was actually a slave, but he was born free. And he was born in a place called Texarkana, Texas. I have a photo here. I Google Mapped it just in case you're curious and want to do a road trip anytime. It would take us 10.5 hours to drive there. So Scott Joplin is most known for writing and performing in the style of ragtime. Here's a definition of ragtime for you if you've never heard of it before. Ragtime is a style of popular music that uses syncopation and is often played on the piano. It was created by Black American musicians in the late 1890s, which is exactly when Scott Joplin was alive and creating music. So he's probably one of the composers I think of most when I think of ragtime music. Now, I used a word that you may or may not know, and that word is syncopation. Try saying it out loud with me. Ready? Syncopation. Interesting word. It has to do with rhythms, so like the pattern that you hear in music. A lot of times when we hear music, we can feel this really steady pulse or beat. So I'm going to start keeping like a steady pulse in my feet. I'll tap it right here so you can see it a little bit better. If you're listening to music, this is what we would normally clap to. It's really easy to hear. A lot of times like drums will make sure that they're emphasizing this steady beat. Syncopation, on the other hand, instead of emphasizing this beat, what it does is it'll start on the beat, but then immediately emphasize something that's not on the beat. So instead of going ta, 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 it'll go ta, D, 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 D. And it'll emphasize something that I'm not padding as the beat. And this style is really important. Partially, I think it sounds really cool. It's very interesting. It gives it personality. I'm going to play a little bit of the melody of the piece we're going to talk about later. So I haven't told you the name of it. It's called Solace. And the opening, like, melody right here goes like this. That's the first little part. And what this does is it emphasizes instead of going, which wouldn't be syncopated. So you're going to hear it all the time in this music, whether you realize it or not. It's what gives it that character and that flair. And part of why I'm spending the time talking about ragtime music and Scott Joplin, why it's so important, is when we think about like modern day jazz, which I'm sure you've heard before, especially if you come to any of the other civic music concerts. Jazz started from things like ragtime. Ragtime totally influenced what became popular in jazz, what became popular in like big band sort of performances. So I think it's great that we're talking about this composer because he's really important. So talking a little bit more about Scott Joplin, he made his money not only as a composer, but as a traveling musician. So he traveled all around the South United States. He traveled to Chicago, to New York, and he did a lot of performing alongside composing. He wrote over 100 different rags. He actually wrote a ballet, which I had never heard of. I learned that as I was looking stuff up. I really want to look that up now because I think that'd be a very interesting thing to see people dancing to. And he wrote some operas. One thing I think is kind of sad is, as good as Scott Joplin was, he actually didn't get a lot of his like fame until after he died. So he died in the early 1900s, but his music became popular again in like the 1970s as people were making new movies. They liked it. There's this really famous movie you may or may not have heard of called The Sting, which is like a heist movie. And in the background, as people are running around, you can hear a lot of these rags being played. And that's where some of his music started to become more popular again. But he didn't necessarily get to reap the reward of that because it was after he had died. He also earned a Pulitzer Prize after he died, which is really cool. I think it speaks a lot to how important he was as a composer. So Scott Joplin, born and raised in the United States, traveled around the United States. The next composer we're going to talk about also came to the United States, and that composer is Antonin Dvořák. Dvorak is a very cool composer. I like him a lot. He does a lot of great things with the viola. He was born in 1841 and died in 1904, so kind of similar dates to Joplin. He was born a little bit earlier, died a little bit earlier, but similar. And he was born in what is now the Czech Republic. A lot of people refer to it also as Bohemia, because countries in that region of the world, also in Europe, they have changed a little bit throughout time, their names and their borders. So he was born in the Czech Republic. He's one of the very first composers that we hear about who came from that country. He's very famous. And he's a part of what we would call the Romantic era. But I think even more important, he was someone who was so proud of where he came from. And he loved using these like traditional folk songs that he grew up hearing or that were popular in his country and incorporating that into his music. So he ended up coming to the US, which is really interesting. They brought him to the US because he was supposed to help discover what we consider American music. And he wrote some things that definitely had like America in the title. He wrote an American quartet. He wrote a symphony called From the New World, which referring to America. And while he was in America, he didn't just stay in places like New York. He actually came here to Iowa too. There's a little town called Spillville, Iowa, where he spent some really like nice quiet time writing, composing, and enjoying the countryside. And now there's even like a bigger population of people who live in Spillville, Iowa, who are from that like Czech Republic heritage, which I think is really interesting. So like I said, he was brought to the United States to help discover American music. He felt that while he was like proud of the music he wrote, I'm sure that a lot of American music should also come from indigenous people from like what is now the United States, as well as Black Americans, which are people like Scott Joplin, who are creating this great music that ended up influencing the music that we hear today. So talking a little bit more about Dvorak, he played the violin, he played the organ, piano. Told you, a lot of composers, they play this piano. But he also played the viola. And I actually have a photo here of me with his viola. Amazing time for me. I know I'm a nerd. You might not identify with that, but man, it was cool. I got to see his viola at his home in Prague. We went, and such a great day. He trained as a butcher when he was younger, so multi-talented individual. And he was the oldest child of 14 kids in his family. So another big family of people who came from musical backgrounds. So we talked about these two composers and what their lives were like a little bit. Let's talk about the music that you're going to hear too. So comparing these pieces of music. The first piece we're going to talk about is Solace by Joplin. It actually is referred to as a Mexican serenade. And that's partially because you're going to hear this rhythm a lot, which is called a habanera rhythm. We hear it a lot in like Latin or Spanish dance music. So you'll hear that throughout the piece. in addition to some of the like, syncopated rhythms that we were talking about. The name solace is actually a word that means comfort in times of sadness or sorrow. So it's not necessarily a super fast, peppy song, but it's really beautiful. Fun fact, it's one of my mom's favorite pieces ever. She absolutely loves this song. So she will be very happy to hear this concert. Yeah, like I said before, I think it was originally created for the piano, part of why we talked about the piano, but now we have a beautiful arrangement for string quartet, which you're going to hear the Belin Quartet play. The second piece you're going to hear is another string quartet. Remember, string quartets are not only like a group of instruments, it's also what we call a piece created for a string quartet. So this is string quartet in E flat, number 10. And very similar to the string quartet last week, it has 4 movements. And those movements have titles that basically tell you the speed that you're going to hear. So our first one is Allegro ma non troppo, so fast, but not like too fast. That's a good way to start off. And then we have number 2 is Giunca, which is Andante con moto. So slower, but with motion. So some of these are like, it's fast, but not too fast. It's slow, but it's still moving. Don't worry about it. Then we have number 3, which is Romanza, Andante con moto again. And then number 4, Finale, which is Allegro assai, so very fast, very lively. A lot of times these string quartets, if in the middle you're like, oh, this is going a little slow, if you wait till the end, you're going to feel a lot of really fun energy, which is part of what makes them so fun to listen to. So we talked about our composers. We talked about their music. I think we've learned a lot today. It's time to review our goals and see if we met them. So our goals were, 1, I can describe how a piano creates sound. And we talked about that. We talked about the different keyboard instruments and the fact that the piano has strings, but it's different from like the violin or viola because we have a hammer hitting those strings as opposed to like a bow pulling the strings. Number 2, I can compare and contrast composers Joplin and Dvorak. Considering they were from completely different parts of the world, they actually have some things in common, like how they were born similar sorts of times, died similar sorts of times. They both spent time in the United States. But in terms of how they composed and what their lives were like, I think they're pretty different. So it's really fun talking about them today. Hopefully you learned something new. Thanks so much for joining us, and I'll see you next week.
Thanks so much to everyone who joined us today, whether you're watching live, I see some of you in the comments section, hi, or whether you're watching after the fact. I hope that you learned something new, but wait, there's something left. Just like last week, we have an activity that you can do after you've watched this video. And this one's designed that if you want to, you can actually print it out and do it while you're listening to the Belin Quartet concert. I don't know about you, but sometimes, even if I love the music, it's nice to have something to do with my hands. So I like having something that I can do that way. So go ahead and head to the Civic Music website. You can click on Education and CMA Studio, and there will be a little link to some coloring pages and a word search that you can do while you're listening to the concert. If you do this activity just like last week, let us know. Send us a selfie of you completing the activity to info@civicmusic.org, and we're going to enter you to win a family pack of tickets to one of our great concerts this fall. So thanks so much for joining us. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I hope to see you next week.